On the surface, he looked like an ordinary scholar, quiet, intelligent, harmless. But behind the door of a small apartment in Russia, investigators would uncover one of the most horrifying secrets in modern criminal history. Inside were dozens of what appeared to be handmade dolls sitting silently in darkened rooms. They wore dresses, makeup, and scarves. Some even played music. But these were not dolls. They were the mummified remains of young girls taken from cemeteries. This is the disturbing story of Anatoly Moskvin, the man the media would later call the Lord of the Mummies. In 2011, police in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, entered Moskvin's apartment during an investigation connected to grave desecration. Officers expected to find stolen objects or evidence of vandalism. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. The apartment was packed from floor to ceiling with books, papers, old photographs, and strange objects. Sitting throughout the rooms were life-sized figures carefully positioned on couches, chairs, and beds. Some wore children's clothing. Others had makeup painted onto their faces. At first glance, they looked like oversized dolls. Then investigators realized the horrifying truth. The figures were made from the preserved remains of children and young girls that had been removed from graves. The silence inside the apartment disturbed investigators deeply. Everything appeared organized, deliberate, almost loving. The bodies had not simply been hidden away. They had been dressed, displayed, and treated as companions. For investigators, the crime scene felt less like an apartment and more like the inside of a disturbed fantasy.
Лежат они уже древненькие. Сколько запах инфицирован. То есть он здесь эти делал, да?
Да, из трупов кукол.
То есть глина такая?
Да.
Там все девочки, да?
Ну, как правило. Вечерние съемки.
What made the case even more disturbing was the man behind it. Anatoly Moskvin did not fit the image of a violent criminal. He was highly educated and respected in certain academic circles. He studied history, languages, and local folklore. Reports suggested he could speak multiple languages and had published articles connected to regional history and cemetery culture. To neighbors, he appeared eccentric but harmless. He lived quietly and spent most of his time reading, researching, or traveling alone. Nobody imagined that beneath his intellectual appearance existed a growing psychological obsession. According to reports, Moskvin developed an unusual fascination with death and funerals during childhood. He later claimed that as a young boy, he witnessed the funeral of a young girl and was allegedly forced by adults at the ceremony to kiss the corpse. Moskvin later described the experience as deeply emotional and psychologically significant. While this incident alone cannot explain his later behavior, some psychologists believe it may have created a distorted emotional connection between death, affection, and human attachment at an early age, combined with years of extreme isolation, loneliness, and obsessive immersion in cemetery culture. That childhood experience may have become the psychological seed from which his disturbing fantasy world slowly developed. Over time, cemeteries became an obsession rather than a curiosity. He spent years visiting graveyards across Russia. He walked long distances studying burial sites, documenting tombstones, and researching the lives of the dead. He reportedly kept extensive notes, maps, and photographs connected to graves he visited. To outsiders, it looked like unusual academic work. But beneath the surface, something darker was developing. Moskvin became increasingly isolated from normal human relationships. He reportedly struggled socially and spent much of his life alone. Over time, his connection to reality appeared to weaken as his obsession with death grew stronger. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they realized this was not random criminal behavior. Everything Anatoly Moskvin did followed a pattern, a ritual. For years, he had secretly traveled between cemeteries across Russia, often walking alone at night for kilometers at a time. He carefully studied obituary notices, funeral records, and grave locations before choosing his targets. Most of the graves belonged to young girls or children. This was not impulsive behavior. It was organized, patient, and deeply obsessive. Under the cover of darkness, Moskvin would exhume bodies from freshly buried graves and transport them back to his apartment without attracting attention. There, he began a disturbing process of preservation. He wrapped the bodies in cloth, stuffed them to maintain their shape, dressed them in children's clothing, applied makeup to their faces. In some cases, he inserted music boxes inside the bodies so they could produce sound when touched. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the case was not what he did. It was why he believed he was doing it. According to reports, Moskvin did not see himself as desecrating the dead. He believed he was rescuing them from loneliness. He reportedly spoke to the bodies, celebrated birthdays with them, and referred to them as though they were still alive. To investigators, the apartment looked horrifying. To Moskvin, it looked like a home. This reveals something deeply unsettling about the human mind. When isolation and obsession grow unchecked for years, fantasy can slowly replace reality itself. Moskvin appeared to create an entire psychological world where death no longer meant separation. The bodies became emotional substitutes, replacements for the human connection he could not build in ordinary life. And over time, the line between companionship and delusion completely disappeared. What makes this especially disturbing is that Moskvin was not acting out of rage or sadistic pleasure. There was no clear desire for violence. His behavior appeared rooted in emotional deprivation, distorted attachment, compulsive fixation, and profound psychological deterioration. The crimes reflected a man attempting to fill emotional emptiness through a fantasy that grew darker with every passing year. And nobody noticed it happening. As the case spread internationally, psychologists and criminologists began asking the same question. How could someone so intelligent descend so deeply into delusion without anyone recognizing the warning signs? Anatoly Moskvin was not socially normal, but he was functional enough to hide in plain sight. He published academic work, held conversations, conducted research. From the outside, he appeared eccentric rather than dangerous. But internally, his psychological world appeared to be collapsing. Experts analyzing the case pointed towards severe social isolation and pathological attachment behavior. Moskvin reportedly struggled to form intimate human relationships throughout his life. Instead of connecting emotionally with living people, he became emotionally attached to the dead. Over time, cemeteries became more than places of study. They became emotional environments where he felt understood, comforted, and psychologically safe. This is where the case becomes psychologically terrifying. Human beings naturally seek attachment and connection. But when those emotional needs are repeatedly unmet, the mind can begin searching for substitutes in deeply abnormal ways. In Moskvin's case, isolation appears to have fused with obsession until fantasy became more emotionally real than reality itself. Some psychologists believed he developed a form of delusional thinking where death was not truly permanent. Others suggested he projected companionship onto the bodies to escape overwhelming loneliness. In many ways, the apartment reflected the inside of Moskvin's mind. Frozen, silent, detached from reality. The bodies were carefully positioned because they represented control, stability, and emotional presence. Unlike living relationships, they could never reject him, abandon him, or judge him. That psychological need for control may explain why his behavior became increasingly ritualistic over time. The apartment was not simply a hiding place. It was the physical manifestation of a disturbed fantasy world he had spent years constructing. After his arrest, Anatoly Moskvin became known internationally as the Lord of the Mummies. The nickname spread rapidly through global media because of the horrifying condition of the apartment and the bizarre psychological nature of the crimes. But beneath the shocking headlines was something much more disturbing than horror alone. The case exposed how severe psychological deterioration can develop quietly over time without drawing attention from the outside world. There were no dramatic warning signs, no public outbursts, no violent attacks. Instead, the descent happened slowly, silently, privately. A lonely man isolated himself deeper and deeper inside his own obsessive reality until the boundary between care and desecration completely disappeared. Courts later ruled that Moskvin suffered from severe psychological disorders, and he was placed in psychiatric treatment rather than receiving a traditional prison sentence. Yet, even after the investigation ended, the case continued haunting psychologists, criminologists, and the public alike because it challenged a deeply uncomfortable belief people hold about dangerous individuals. Most people expect monsters to look frightening, violent, unstable, obviously disturbed, but Anatoly Moskvin looked like an ordinary intellectual living an ordinary life. And that is what makes this case unforgettable. Because the true horror was not simply what investigators discovered inside the apartment. The true horror was realizing that a deeply fractured mind had existed quietly among ordinary people for years, unnoticed. The story of Anatoly Moskvin remains one of the clearest examples of how isolation, obsession, and untreated psychological deterioration can slowly consume a human being from the inside out. Sometimes the darkest minds are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they whisper quietly behind closed doors.